Okay, my name is Charlie Morgan from Charlie Morgan Grassmaster Limited, and we're here today in Great House Farm, Sansoy. And the reason for being here today is basically after a very difficult season last year, we need to examine the state of our soils because the rain and the wetness has seriously compacted our ground. Our stock obviously has poached and damaged it. Our winter housing costs are rising significantly. We're short of silage that we need to get animals out, and we're still looking for grass. And part of the reason for the problems we're going to have, or some farmers are going to experience, is that we need to look at their nutrients, and there's nutrient management plans available at 80% grant aid from the Welsh Assembly, and farmers should look to use those because we are potentially losing things like phosphate, and nitrogen will be depleted this year, but more importantly also lime. So therefore we need to enhance these nutrients, what we've got left, and we need to put the right amount in. With compacted soils that we have, there's no guarantee that the roots are actually going to access the nutrients we put down. If we've got surface compaction, then the chances are when the fertilizers go down, any rainfall will wash our nutrients out of the field on the surface, and obviously that's a pollution issue to the water course and damages our environment in terms of our water quality. So therefore we need to dig these holes, we need to do some examine some pits and have a look at the status of our soil. So we'll have a go at this first, identifying where our problems will occur. And as you can see, it's pretty firm, and then depending on the position of the damage, we will choose the machine to fix the job. There's an array of machines here today looking at different levels of compactions in different areas within the soil, and of course the machines are only there to actually encourage worm activity, because the most important thing we have on our farm is the little worm. That is an animal on our farm that we seriously underestimate. There is, in a good population of worms on a farm, about 6 tonne per hectare, and with 6 tonne per hectare of worms will determine how many animals above ground we can carry. We need to be looking at having at least 10 worms in a plug of soil this sort of size, and the worm activity obviously is going to be pretty important because we need to have 25% air in our soils, and those worms create that air potential. They also then let water percolate down through rather than sit on the surface or run off and take our nutrients away. It allows our grasses and the roots in our grasses to traverse down through where the worm has been, so we get greater efficiencies in our soil. We could have on a hectare of soil up to 5 tonne of nitrogen, or even in excess on a permanent pasture, but it has to be accessible to the roots. And if we have a look at this plug of soil here, and initially we'll look at the colour, and the colour needs to be uniform right the way through, and it's not too bad, but it's darker up here than it is down here, so that shows a greater amount of organic matter and nutrients on the surface, not percolating down through the system. We also want to smell it, and if you're somebody who uses a considerable amount of slurry and such like, or ploughs in manures, then they could be sitting within horizons and they would be anaerobic if there's no air there, and it would smell rather nasty. Probably the main thing we're looking for is where the roots come out, the rooting depth. Now as we look at the bottom of this plug of soil that's naturally broken at this point, I don't see many roots, and really grass roots should have the ability to go down at least a foot, the modern day varieties even further. So we're actually potentially only farming here 3 to 4 inches where we have a lot more soil depth. But the other thing that we can notice quite easily across here is there's a smear line across here, and then there's a natural crack. Now that will be one of our main compaction points is at this point. The compaction we can test by pressing our thumb, and any indentation will show us that there's not much compaction, but in actual fact right the way through that piece, and especially on that point there, we've got quite a bit of compaction. Now compaction is created by different things. Elements, constant rainfall will compact on the surface, sheep will compact the first inch, cattle probably the next 2 to 3, and then machinery at the next point. And eventually you will have a plough pan at some point. So there could be variations of where that occurs. What we can see here is virtually all the main 3 together compacting the lot. If we try and break it, we should see that there's virtually no air pockets, it's a solid block. We can also see that any worm we do have is running along the surface. So there's a little fella here just running the surface because he's not able to work any deeper, and therefore if he's eating any organic matter, any manures or dying grass, he starts to bring that into the soil, and therefore it's not getting taken any further down because of the compaction. Also, you can see that there is orange flecks within the soil, little points of orange flecks here right the way through, and that's iron oxide, and that's showing temporary waterlogging. So even though this is a fairly dry soil in effect on a sloping field where this water shouldn't be actually standing, it has been. Now if that is standing, it's holding our temperatures colder, so our grass is slower to get away. It's also having wet feet through most of the year, so poaching is even worse, and that is costing our businesses a considerable amount of money. It means that our stock are housed for longer because the ground's too wet to turn stock out to. It's too wet to get machinery on to put fertiliser down, and that's increasing our housing costs. It's costing at the minute between £1.70 and £2 to house a cow per day. So every day your cows go out earlier can be a considerable saving. And having the right sort of aeration with the machines behind us is going to give the opportunity for the worm population to increase to do so. So we break it up a little bit more, we'll see if we've got any worm activity at all, and as we can see, we're never going to hit 8 to 10 worms in a piece of soil like this. Anything that's angular, as in breaking it, anything that breaks angular like this piece of soil here has to be made by man. Man's actions create that angular soil. Natural occurring soils will crumble easily and always be rounded. So we can see that we've created the damage. Now, the damage in this soil we know is at least 4 inches deep. So therefore we need a piece of machinery that can break below that 4 inches. The key message here is always going to have to be, we must get below the deepest compaction point. So for the example today, I haven't actually dug this hole deep enough to examine yet, but wherever the deepest compaction point is, we must make sure we get below it. Because if we puncture a hole with any bits of this machinery behind us, and we don't get below the compaction point, that hole can effectively fill with water, and then we have a worse problem than we had if we did nothing. So we need to get below it, and therefore that's why the spade is such an imperative piece of machinery to decide where the problem occurs before we go out and either purchase or hire or bring a contractor in to potentially fix the job, because we could make it worse. The timing of this operation is quite critical. We usually say it's a spring or autumn job, but of course we don't have a spring or autumn just recently. So it's all to do with soil conditions, and the soil basically has to be moist enough that we can get the machine in the ground, and today it's almost too dry. But very recently it would have been too wet, and if it was too wet we just smear our soils and create that pond. The window of opportunity for a piece of machinery like this is very limited, and therefore we do really have to be on the ball with our spade to get the timing correct. Of course that'll be different across every field, because some fields will hold wet because they're heavier clay soils, some fields are dry banks, so we have to assess every field on its own merit. One of the initial assessments that we should make on our farm considering compaction is to actually evaluate the condition of our sward to start with. And if you look at this sward in front of us at the moment now, it is relatively open. There's a lot of bare patches, which means that we're struggling to grow grass. What's going to take over in that patch is potentially a weed, so our swards aren't going to last very long. We need to assess how much ryegrass we've got. In actual fact, when we look for the ryegrass, there's not an awful lot of it, but what we can see is this type of grass here, which is called creeping bent. And this creeping bent is going to be the first one to colonate all these bare gaps, because it's actually able to move, and therefore the quality of our sward is falling all the time. So even if there is adequate grass here, the quality of the grass is not good enough. So by assessing what we've got on the surface first of all will give us some indicators of what's going to be under the soil.